Welcome to a family-friendly edition of the Think Christian podcast, where we believe there's no such thing as secular. I'm Josh Larson. Glad to have you listening. We're going to do this one for the children. The notion of family is integral to the Christian story. When God called his people, it was as a family first, the family of Abram. The history of the nation of Israel, then, is really a family photo album. Now, that picture shifts a bit in the New Testament with the vision of the church as the family unit, but even then, God meets us as a father and son. So how does all that inform the way we think about family today? And how does pop culture play a part in our conception of the family? The Marvel Cinematic Universe, of all places, is exploring these notions with WandaVision, a new series on Disney+, in which superheroes Wanda Maximoff and Vision find themselves playing husband and wife in a strangely familiar family sitcom. In the new film Minari, which opens February 12 in theaters and then February 26 on demand, family is a core concern. This is a 1980s set drama from writer-director Lee Isaac Chung. It follows a Korean-American couple who have moved, along with their 2 young children, from California to Arkansas to pursue the American dream by starting their own farm. Michelle Reyes will be along shortly to discuss Minari. We're going to start in the MCU, or at least a bizarre televised offshoot of it, with Sarah Welch Larson and WandaVision. Sarah Welch Larson has kept an eye on the Marvel Cinematic Universe for us, writing about both Infinity War and Endgame on the website, so she seemed like a good person to talk about WandaVision, the new Disney Plus limited series that features 2 Avengers characters, Wanda Maximoff and Vision. Sarah, welcome. And first I have to ask, would you say this is maybe the weirdest thing Marvel has ever done? How would you even describe WandaVision?
Oh my gosh, a tour through sitcoms? Or at least sitcom tropes, I feel like, but starring superheroes that didn't really get a ton of screen time in the MCU. Like, I'm really enjoying getting to know these characters in a context that, I don't know how much we want to talk about it, but a context that probably isn't real. And characters who have already gotten more screen time in this TV series, like 3 episodes in, than they ever got in any of the movies, I think.
Yeah, that's kind of been one of the catches I've heard some people say is, why would I be that interested in these 2 characters? Because we haven't had a chance to get to know them that well. But it sounds like in your case, that's a draw. It's more of an opportunity.
Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of storytelling that develops by developing the characters more so than plot, which the MCU is a lot of things, and it's especially plot heavy. So it's been kind of nice to just hang out with these characters and explore them through these sitcom-y tropes that I'm more or less familiar with at the very least. And I feel like the way that these characters react to the situations that they're in informs who they are in a way that I find kind of fascinating and honestly a lot more interesting than them getting into a fight with the light that's shooting off into the sky.
Which, yeah, that's a lot of what we saw them do in the movies. We should say Wanda played by Elizabeth Olsen and Vision played by Paul Bettany. And yeah, I think it's fair to say that they're in this reality that they're not quite sure what to make of it, and we're not quite sure what to make of it. We've seen 3 episodes now, the both of us, and each one has seemed to be a spin on an era of family-oriented sitcoms. So from the 50s to the 60s, and the 3rd episode, we're kind of more in the 70s, and each one has had the tropes, the aesthetics of those eras. So I've heard the hair of those eras for sure, which is quite amusing. You know, I've heard references from everything the Dick Van Dyke Show to I Dream of Jeannie to the Brady Bunch. And it kind of depends on what your experience with those original sitcoms has been, which ones you'll kind of pinpoint as their touch points. But yeah, it's kind of dropping these 2 characters in this suburban sitcom setting and watch them both at once act out the tropes and try to figure out why they are acting out the tropes. And that's kind of been a little bit of the disconnect for me, is how aware are they of this? And I think that's a subplot that is slowly developing. We're going to find out more about, I think, as this series goes on. I've just found it to be, kind of excitingly bizarre, just so unexpected. And maybe it's a reaction to MCU burnout that I did kind of feel just before, around the end of Infinity War and Endgame, and just to go in a completely different direction has been refreshing to me. I think it's revealing too of what a formula family sitcoms have been for decades and how ingrained they are in my body rhythm. So, not quite old enough to remember the Dick Van Dyke Show, but certainly growing up in the 80s and the 90s, these tropes were still well used. So from the punchlines to the laugh tracks to the camera cutting to reaction shots, it's all so familiar to me. And I think one of the greatest pleasures has been watching Olsen and Bettany lean into those tropes. And they're so good at it, hitting these outdated performance styles in a way that perfectly matches what the series wants to do. And then there'll be moments where they suddenly shift into contemporary seriousness when they seem to have that awareness we're talking about that momentarily intrudes on the fakey TV showness of it. They can kind of shift in and out of those modes so effortlessly. And I think it is partly getting to know their characters a little bit more, as you say, but also getting to appreciate them as actors, getting to do more than they were allowed in the films.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because the show feels like it's been made with a lot of love for a lot of these tropes, even and especially when it's kind of putting a spin on it and saying, like, look at how hokey some of this is. Like, I can tell that whoever was responsible for designing the sets paid a lot of attention to things like I Love Lucy and Leave It to Beaver. And I don't know, I saw a lot of DNA from a lot of different TV shows that felt like it wasn't making fun of any of these shows, but really, like, I hate saying a love letter, but it is a love letter to the sitcom throughout history. And I'm really curious to see, like, where they're going to go, how they're going to develop. Like, even the camera work is different from episode to episode. Like,
Yeah.
it's very fixed and static in that first episode in the 50s. And then it's a little more dynamic, and the lighting's a little bit different when they move up to the 70s in the third episode. And I'm really curious to see where they're going to go. I'm personally going to die if they do a spin-off The Good Place, which
We'll see if they
it's
get
kind
that
of on
far.
my wish list there.
Yeah, that is interesting. I haven't thought about how far into the decades will they go? How contemporary will they get? I guess that'll be really intriguing to find out. And yeah, the first two episodes in black and white, as you're talking about, the third one in color. So there's definitely a progression there. And I do feel these aren't like lazy pot shots at those sitcoms at all. They are honoring them in a way in the attention to detail and, the level of production design and so forth that's going on here. So I guess the question, and maybe this is something we just have to wait to have answered, but midway through or at the beginning here, how do you see this fitting into the larger MCU? Not necessarily timeline-wise or plot-wise. We'll leave that guessing up to others. But just thematically, like, why do this? Why do you think Marvel, Disney would even be interested in a little side road like this?
That's a really good question. I think on the speculation side, I've seen some stuff that does have to do with tying it in a little bit more to the Marvel comic books, and especially, I think it's the House of M plotline, which deals a lot more with the mutants. Thematically, from the MCU standpoint, this really feels like it's a meditation on who these people are as superheroes. And I think that that's a through line in a lot of the MCU is this idea of identity and why you want to get involved in these heroics in the first place. And with these two particular characters, they've really only been defined in relationship to other characters. So it's been interesting to see them both as individuals and then also kind of bouncing off each other in interesting ways. They're kind of growing and developing a family that feels a lot more organic than a lot of the other, like, more individual people groupings that show up in the MCU. Like, there are romantic relationships and then there are rivalries, but this is the first one that actually feels like these two people are a dynamic unit who do genuinely love and care about each other, regardless of their superhero abilities.
And that sort of brings us, to the larger theme for this show, this idea of family. And it strikes me that this is partly what WandaVision is interested in, is exploring what that has meant across time in North America. And I think that, the story of family can be told through sitcoms across the decades. And it's both a mirror, but maybe more a myth that the sitcoms have presented us, right? And this has been one of the forces that's led to what you could call the idolization of the family unit in North America. I think another force, interestingly enough, is probably evangelical Christianity, which has come to, literally focus on the family to such a degree that in some circles, it's almost like having a happy, healthy family is equated with being Christian, that those two things are synonymous. And of course, that leaves behind singles, divorced folks, all sorts of others. So that's one force I think you and I are maybe more familiar with. But there's also the force of suburbia, which I think, post World War II kind of became the landscape for this idealized family unit where you can get the house, the dog, the fence, the 2.5 kids or whatever. And that's what we see in WandaVision. That's the setting. And with that, with suburbia came along the capitalistic infrastructure to support it. So supermarkets, shopping malls. So that's a force. And then another force is pop culture itself, which uses shows like Leave It to Beaver, Dick Van Dyke, these ones we've been mentioning, even the Brady Bunch, maybe in its own way, though that was a different look at a family unit. And all of these are things that WandaVision does delve into and explore from a different perspective. So I'm curious what that has felt like for you, Sarah, watching WandaVision and keeping this idea of the family unit as a traditional element in so many sitcoms across so many decades. How has WandaVision seemed to be playing with that for you?
Well, it's interesting because the whole show seems to be about keeping up this facade. Like Wanda and Vision themselves are trying to hide their super identities, which is a common theme in superhero stories, but sitcoms are also kind of a facade. I mean, the picture of family units in these sitcoms has never really existed in a perfect way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the same with suburbia, which is also quite often at least depicted in pop culture as being this place where there is this facade of perfection that doesn't really exist. And I think that paired with the idea of these two characters who are either in denial or hiding who they are, and who are also either being deluded or deluding themselves into believing a picture of reality that does not exist. I think that those two themes really mesh incredibly well. I have no idea where it's going.
Right. Well, as you're talking, like it could go two ways. It could be they're deluding themselves or they're being deluded,
Mm-hmm. Or a combination.
Or a combination, which I think is interesting. It seems to me, that the very first episode, it's all about almost serving the husband. And, the plot line is about Vision's boss coming to dinner and they have to scramble to get ready. And the joke there almost seems to be that you have to have superpowers. Wanda needs superpowers to even fulfill these patriarchal expectations. Otherwise, there'd be no hope. So even as they're recreating that era and that myth, they're kind of puncturing it at the same time, which has been interesting. And then episode 2 seems to suggest that they're not going to fit into this town, which they're desperately trying to do, until they have children. It's like they're not really trusted, almost. There are so many references to we're doing this for the children. There's a fundraiser for the children. And of course, at the end of the episode, it's revealed that she's pregnant suddenly in ways we don't quite understand. And then episode 3 opens with this really eerie theme song. They all have interesting period-specific theme songs, but in episode 3, there's the lyric about like together 1 + 1 is more than 2, and something about 1 + 1 being family.
It almost felt like too many cooks to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then so there's kind of this pressure of holding up that facade that you're talking about that we sense in different ways in each of the episodes.
And it kind of builds on top of each other too, right? Like there's this idea of fitting in, and then in order to keep fitting in, you have to have those kids. And then in order to keep fitting in, you have to keep on piling up all of these other expectations, which, I mean, anybody would collapse under that weight. It's not something that's really sustainable because it's not something that's anybody has ever been able to successfully pull off.
So I got another question for you, and I think that WandaVision's suggestion so far is something like one of its suggestions that focusing on the family to this degree in a way that, as you said, is not even possible to attain or maintain is kind of a distraction from reality. It's almost like some of the other players that we meet, from Catherine Hahn, who's a nosy neighbor.
She's
and
so
a
great.
few other, yeah, she's great in everything and really good here, having a lot of fun with those cliched roles and performances. But yeah, it's almost like she's there to distract them from what is really going on and using this emphasis on family or suburbia or this perfect life in this perfect town as a way to distract them. And I wonder if there is something there about our emphasis on the family, and maybe particularly for Christians, how maybe it can distract us from other important things that matter beyond our four walls. And so then the more we look in, the less we're going to look out. I don't know if there's anything there here.
I think that resonates with me because if you are so focused on building up a perception of yourself to other people, then you're going to be focused on fueling that perception instead of actually focusing on the things that make life worth living. And then you're also, that particular way of living also forces you to pretend that you are perfect in a way that nobody ever really is perfect, which also means that you're probably not going to be as inclined to accept grace towards yourself for your own failings, and then also to extend that grace to other people. Because if you appear perfect, then everybody else should be doing the same thing at the same time. And that's just not a good way to live in community with other people.
Yeah. And you see that, I think, especially in episode 2, where we do meet more of the neighbors and the people who live in town and this neighborhood talent show they get involved in, which is a competition in a number of ways. Definitely some humor in those moments, but I think others that get on those points you're touching on. Anything else before we wrap up about WandaVision you wanted to hit, or you want to make any predictions about the ending so we can look like we had it all wrong?
Oh, I've given up on predictions since watching Lost about 10 years ago. So I'm just along for the ride. But one of the things that I really do love is this show's attention to detail. There is so much going for it in terms of costume design and set design. And I read somewhere that they even used like period correct lighting for a lot of these sets. So if anything, just watching it for the loving detail that's put into this TV show is probably worth it.
Yeah, I think the opening credits of each show, which, as I said, have different music and are a little bit different each time, those are just a joy to watch on their own. Would you say this has jump-started your interest in the MCU, which was, somewhat on pause last year because of the pandemic? I don't know, maybe you never faded in your interest, but if so, has this kind of reignited that for you at all?
I'm more interested in it because it is so character-focused storytelling. If it does turn into a lot of flashing lights and fights, then I'm probably going to check out again.
Yeah, that's kind of where I am too. So we'll see where it takes us. Thank you very much, Sarah. Why don't you remind listeners where they can follow you, especially if they want to hear as soon as your book is available, Becoming Alien. It's around the corner, right?
It's coming out beginning of March. Yeah, you can follow me around the internet, but especially on Twitter under the handle Dodgy Boffin, which is where I spend most of my time shouting about science fiction and especially about the Alien movies. So you can definitely find me there.
All right. Thanks so much, Sarah. Take care.
Thank you. You too.
I remember on a family road trip once, I was listening to one of my mixtapes, blissfully unaware of the bickering and backtalk going on between my brothers, a couple of my cousins, and my mom, who was driving. I had my headphones on and was just staring out the window when suddenly my mom pulled that brown van over to the side of Interstate 80 and got all of us, myself included, out, lined us up on the side of the van and tried to give us a spanking with an old cowboy boot. A trucker honked as he passed and we all fell out laughing, including my mom. Hello, I'm John J. Thompson, and hate 'em, love 'em, confused by how you could possibly be related to them, or desperate to see them again as soon as possible, or maybe all of the above in equal and alternating installments every day. Family is a theme that haunts modern music in lovely ways. You just heard a little bit of Ode to Family by the Cranberries, and it was not hard for me, your musical big brother, to find a bumper crop of songs grappling with the ups and downs of walking through life with the people with whom we share DNA. In this episode's mix, you'll find songs from Drew Holcomb, Sly and the Family Stone, Madness, Avett Brothers, Mary J. Blige, John Prine, Chevelle, Dan Fogelberg, and many more. And I hear that if you light a candle and drop the digital needle on Chance the Rapper's Family, which you will hear a little bit later in the show here, you'll see your future. To listen along, just search for the Think Christian profile on Spotify and hit play. This episode's playlist will be called The Latest Episode for a while and listed as its own mix separately thereafter. And you can hear all of the mixes I have curated for the podcast there, either individually or gathered together in the archive list. And if you come across any other songs that make you think of the theme of family, tweet at me at John J. Thompson and I might add them to the mix. Maybe the next time we all load into the family truckster for a road trip, we can crank this mix up and listen together. That's it for now. Until next time, this is John J. Thompson telling you to stop fighting back there. Don't make me pull this van over.
The positive word of mouth for Minari has been steadily, if quietly, growing for about a year now, ever since it debuted at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival. Now, like so many movies, its release was pushed back due to COVID-19, but finally, it's here, coming out on February 12 in limited theaters and then February 26 on demand, which would still qualify it for this year's delayed Oscars. Michelle Reyes is here to discuss the film, and I'm curious, Michelle, if you had heard much about Minari before getting a chance to see it recently, and if you think it makes for a quote-unquote Oscar movie.
Oh, for sure. Being part of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, where I serve as vice president, there has been buzz about Minari since last fall. And a lot of people on staff and people part of the AACC community watched it in December. And then, of course, early January. And so I myself, was able to watch it early as well. And I loved it. And I'm second generation Indian American, but hearing from so many friends who are Korean, 1.5 generations, second generation Korean American, everybody that I've heard from just loves this film, absolutely loves it. So I'm just thrilled for it to come out.
Well, as I mentioned at the top of the show, the film stars Steven Yeun and Yuri Han as Jacob and Monica. They play a Korean-American couple who've moved from California to Arkansas in the 1980s, along with their 2 young children. The idea is to start a small farm there. This is based on writer-director Lee Isaac Chung's own childhood experiences, so it's something of a fictionalized memoir, I guess you could describe it, from a very specific cultural point of view, though, different from what we usually get in an American film. And as you were just describing, Michelle, that point of view was an important distinction for you. So maybe talk a little bit more about what it was like to see a movie from this perspective.
Yeah, definitely. Well, first, I realized I didn't answer your second question. I do think this is Oscar worthy, and I hope it is a contender, as well as in terms of, what it means to be an American film that is worthy of an Oscar. But I resonated with this film for so many reasons. This podcast with you could truly be like a 2-hour-long conversation. But I think what's so powerful about the film is that it really narrows in and focuses on a child's perspective of their parents' life and experiences. And as you mentioned, it's a semi-autobiographical take on Lee Chung's own childhood. And we really get this view of David's view of his own father, Jacob. And, the camera lens is frequently focusing on David. It feels like it's shot at the hip at times. It's at the same level that Jacob, his 6-year-old head would be seeing the world. A lot of low-angle shots of the interior of the family's trailer and surrounding land, which also oftentimes evokes these feelings of being small in the world and this childlike perspective. Now, David doesn't fully understand his father, and this is part of the universal resonance of this film, because for many of us, we don't always know or fully understand our parents' generation and experiences. And there's so many disconnects. And I think this is especially true with the immigrant experience and between first, second, and third gen Asian Americans. And in this film, the parents, they still know what life was like in Korea, and they speak Korean, and the children speak English back to them, which there's so many subtle details that I just love about the film. And one of them is just how seamlessly the subtitles go back and forth between Korean and English. It's such a small detail, but it's very thoughtfully included. But then also, the son complains that his grandma smells like Korea. He doesn't like the drinks that she brings from Korea, which leads to his revenge drink.
That's quite a scene.
But, part of our disconnect from our parents is because we romanticize our own childhood, and we don't fully see the generation prior to our own. And that being said, oftentimes when we become parents, we're able to look back and see our parents in a different light, and we begin to appreciate what they did or they went through. And in fact, becoming parents, as well as even becoming a wife or a husband, can create new bonds with our parents. And I really love Steven Yeun talked about this in a panel discussion with Sandra Oh, that his role in playing the father in this movie, in playing Jacob in this movie, helped shift his own perspective of his own father in coming to America. So I do think that, interestingly enough, valuing our parents' perspective is something that is deeply biblical. I'm thinking of the book of Proverbs that's full of these sayings about listening to your father and mother and not despising them when they're old, staying close and connected to them. And Minari challenges us to stay humble enough to realize our parents had struggles we may not fully ever see or understand, and that each generation struggles to survive in its own way. And we have to give them that grace and respect, or more grace and respect than we often do.
I love that you're talking about perspective so much, because I think that is absolutely key to this movie, not only thematically, but as you described, the very way it's made with those camera angles. The opening shot, I think, is from David's perspective in the backseat of the car as his mother's driving to this farm. His older sister is in the front seat. So we see immediately the film places us in his head, looking at things from his point of view. Just as you say, David, we should mention, played by Alan Kim. And yes, the grandmother who comes on the scene a little later, played by Yoon Yoo-jun. And the dynamic there among the generations is absolutely distinct. You know, this woman who is coming, from what I understand, from Korea in that moment to live with them. Then the parent generation, who is somewhat in between, as you described, and then David, who is growing up as an American, but within this family. And they're each trying to figure out the distinct identities that those generations represent. Yeah, I want to stick on this topic of family because I really think it's a fitting one for this episode and for what Minari is interested overall. For me, it really highlighted the role of sacrifice within the family dynamic. And if you think about it, when we enter into a family, whether that's a marriage or whether as parents, we're essentially agreeing that in many ways, we're going to put others ahead of ourselves. Within, specifically, you know, you can do that as a person in many circles, but this is specifically within intimate, close quarter relationships. These domestic relationships, we've chosen when we enter that to put others ahead of ourselves. And that's a distinctly Christian dynamic, right? It mirrors how we are called to live as Christians, following the model of Christ, sacrificing for the sake of others. Now, it doesn't mean we're choosing to suffer. That, you know, it's not like we're totally having to give up our sense of self. I think probably the joy of a healthy family is that sometimes we're on the receiving end of a spouse's sacrifice or a parent's sacrifice. So really it's this relational unit. And in that way, it kind of is reflective of the Trinity. So there's a lot of resonance with the Christian call to living and how I think a healthy family lives together. And I think Minari explores this tension really, really well. One of the central questions for me, definitely it's the generational thing as an immigrant family that you're talking about. And related to that is this question of Jacob's dream, the father's dream of this farm, which he talks about it in that language. And Monica, his wife, talks about it that way too. And so the question is this a faithful way of providing for his family? He even says the Garden of Eden, right? Or is it a selfish dream? Is it something that's possibly being pursued at their expense? And I think the movie, again, related to perspective, depending where we're looking at this, it goes back and forth on that. There is a ton of nuance in this movie where it's not just demonizing the father for pursuing the dream, but it is questioning his motives. Maybe a scene that stood out to me that speaks to the nuance is Monica, the wife, and these are both great performances, among my favorite ones of the year, I've got to say, by Steven Yeun and Yeri Han. And this scene between them, he comes in from a hard day of work on the farm, so stiff from the labor that he asks for help, even just getting his shirt off. At this point, they've had some very serious arguments about whether this was a mistake. There is a rift between them on this topic of the farm. But he comes in, asks for help. She slowly peels it off, helps him into the tub, and he can't even wash himself. So as he sits there hunched over in pain, she just pours water over him. And that was just, to me, such a beautiful picture of family that is in tension and is negotiating this idea of sacrifice. What is she giving to him in that moment? How does it work against what he might be taking away from the family? I'm afraid Minari is going to be written off as a feel-good movie, which is fine. But I also want to call attention to a scene like that because I think it's more nuanced than that as well.
That's right. That's right. And, you know, speaking of sacrifice, not only is this a movie like a coming of age movie, it's very much a pioneering movie, right? I mean, they're trying to reframe the American dream through the Korean American experience, which you can't help but sort of harken back to those olden days of people, you know, going out west and forging it on their own. And, you know, for the South Korean family, it's moving first from Korea to California to now rural Arkansas. And they're navigating these challenges of home and life in unfamiliar territory. And, you know, for me, even their moving house, right? This house on wheels, a modern nod to covered wagons, I think. And, you know, they're braving into unknown territory, moving east rather than early European pioneers moving west. So I think there's a lot of these kinds of reversals in the film and what it means to pursue the American dream and the sacrifices necessary, but also at what cost to the family. So I think it's really continuing the sort of age-old narrative within American history that isn't easily resolved. And speaking of lack of resolution, the ending of the film just, I think I gasped when the screen went black because I was like, that's it? I wouldn't say that it's a happy ending. Not everything is tied up perfectly. So I think this is where sacrifice and resilience go hand in hand. And even after I finished watching the film, I was thinking about the title, Minari. Like, why did they call this film Minari? It's interesting that of all the things that Sunja, the grandmother, brings from Korea, one of it is these seeds, Minari seeds. It's a plant also known as water celery. It kind of looks like parsley. It grows really well and fast in these moist areas. And so she takes her grandson, David, to go plant them by the creek. And that for me was one of the most powerful sort of monologues in the film of the grandmother telling her grandson about how this plant is resilient and useful and it'll bring plentiful growth, if you will. And interestingly enough, this plant and water, I think those are two major symbols in the film. The water from the river sustains the family when they can't pay their water bill. The father is wholly dependent on rain and water for his garden to survive. And even the mountain dew is called mountain water. But it's Minari, this plant that first bonds the grandmother and grandson together. And the film, well, I won't talk about the ending now, but Minari comes back at the end of the film. And it kind of feels like this very unique piece of the family's culture, something very distinctly Korean, is going to keep them together, and together they will survive. And so even with those questions of like, were these the right sacrifices to make? Are these the right decisions for the family? That resilience, they will make it, I think is what comes through at the end.
Yeah, that scene where the grandmother is planting the seeds with David is really sweet and genuine as well. And yeah, as to the ending, fair to say it's open-ended in a lot of ways, which are the kind of endings I usually prefer. There is some resolution, absolutely, but we can also imagine their story ourselves from this point on, and that could go in different directions depending on our own experiences and our own understanding of family and these sorts of things. So I think that's to the film's credit too. I did want to ask you, I think we should touch on just this movie's depiction of Christianity because it's a fairly prominent presence in this film.
Yes.
I think if you break it down, you could maybe say there are three different expressions of religion. You've got the family's own faith, and that's demonstrated mainly in these bedtime prayers between Monica, the mother, and David, the son. He has this heart condition that's fairly serious, and so she encourages him to pray for his heart condition every night. Jacob, the father, seems a little more removed from their faith life, but that's one strand in the family. Then you have this homey evangelical Arkansas church that they attend. Some very interesting scenes set there. And then the third strand is this Pentecostal-like laborer played by Will Patton who works for Jacob. He speaks in tongues, he prays over the crops, and spends his Sundays dragging a cross down a dirt road. So these are three very different depictions of Christianity, I feel like. I would love to hear what you made of all that.
That's right. Just such fascinating depictions and commentary. I will say I was happily surprised in the film's portrayal of Christians and the church. It is interesting even that because they are disconnected from an immigrant church because it's rural Arkansas. It's not the city. It's not some large Korean American demographic that they can be part of. They go to this church, but the grandmother, Sunja, she does bring these VHS tapes of Koreans singing, and they watch that on television at night, almost as a makeshift way to still be connected to the Korean American Christian body. But then alongside of that, the family starts going to a white American church at one point, and those are some of the most awkward scenes in the whole film because the one white boy and the one white girl, they do some really awkward, weird stuff. Like when the girl starts going through these sounds, until she lands on one that Anne recognizes as Korean, but you just kind of like bristle at that. But at the same time, it's not racist. These encounters come across less prejudiced than they are just simply born out of naivete in this rural town. The people are still
maybe
kind. Yeah, ignorance, but not cruel, if you will. And I think that does pair, in a sense, with also Will Patton's figure as this local Pentecostal man. And you're right, he speaks in tongues. He carries this cross on Sundays. And it's not just praying over the land. He's like trying to rid the land and even their house of demons.
That's right.
There's like some exorcism going on here. But he's also a complex character because he's a war veteran and he has these Korean bills in his wallet. And as Jacob and Paul work together on the farm, they don't talk much outside of, talking about the produce, but they do come to this mutual understanding of their different paths in life. And out of this mutual need to survive, they become friends. And so in many ways, this rural Arkansas Pentecostal man and this Korean American man, they're both judged by face value from the outside world, but Minari shows the companionship that can be reached through kindness, mutual help, and shared experiences. I just found that very refreshing. I appreciate it, but you're right, you can't escape these religious elements throughout the film.
I was kind of puzzled by them, to be honest, because they're depicted in a very removed manner, I feel like, almost anthropological. Like we've dropped down in this, especially when it comes to the white evangelical church, we've dropped down here and we're just going to observe what are the practices and traditions. And even the family's prayer times kind of feel that way. But as you talk now, Michelle, and what you were saying earlier about perspective, I think it's because we are seeing this all from David's perspective. So he's not judging or trying to pigeonhole these expressions of Christianity in some way. He's just observing. Here's how this person practices. Here's how this person practices. And for him, they may feel like totally different religions, but we're just looking at it from our own perspective. But I think that's why the movie feels that way a bit, because it's this young boy's understanding of these different traditions. So, Michelle, is there anything else you wanted to cover? I know you said we could talk for 2 hours, but we don't want to quite do that. But maybe there's one other note you wanted to hit about Minari?
Yeah. As there are these burgeoning Korean American films coming on the scene and Asian American films on the scene, then you start to compare them, right, with other films. And I think it's interesting that for a lot of Korean Americans, they're also comparing this movie, Minari, with Hillbilly Elegy. And I think there's some interesting analysis there. But I'll say briefly, when you watch Minari, you can't help but feel like, okay, this is a very distinctly Korean American film, because all of the markers are there, right? The food, like you mentioned, the way they wash with the water buckets, speaking in Korean is so at the forefront of everything that happens in this film. And I think there are a few people that felt like, oh, that could have been a little bit more subtle. The Koreanness could have been a bit more subtle. But so I think that was an interesting comment that I heard from a few friends. And then also, as you mentioned, going back to just the whole concept of sacrifice, like you said, this childlike perspective, the judgment is withheld from the sacrifices that Jacob is making about his family. But another comment I've heard over and over again from Korean American friends is they're like, that's my dad. That's my dad.
Interesting.
Like, so many people see their own father represented in Jacob. And so I think the moral judgment is suspended just because it's such a realistic portrayal of second generation fathers. So those are just two interesting comments as well.
Yes, for that viewer, it's incredibly personal. Whereas it kind of brings to the larger question of, as this film is being envisioned and made, and even as Lee Isaac Chung is kind of filtering his own childhood experiences, who is he envisioning as the audience? The movie might be trying to speak to multiple audiences, those who aren't familiar with this background at all. And in that way, the practices, the traditions are an introduction, or those audiences for who this is going to be, as you describe, incredibly personal and familiar. And is this a movie that manages to say something to both of those audiences as well as the others who might be watching it too? So I think my guess is it seems to be, again, nuanced enough to pull that off. But that's why we're bringing people from all different perspectives to get their take, to see what they think about it. So I'm glad you could definitely offer that today, Michelle. Minari, as we mentioned, it's going to have a limited theatrical run on February 12th, so probably not a chance for a lot of people to see it that way, especially with concerns about being in theaters still right now. But on February 26th, it will be available on demand. So if it's one that sounds interesting to you, that's one way you can definitely check it out, February 26th. Really glad I was able to get your thoughts on this, Michelle. Thanks so much.
Oh, this was fun. Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll talk again soon, okay?
Okay.
Come kick action. Stand in the land where the fam won't stay. Grind all day till the fam okay. But still want my heart to hear my grandma play. For the fam and my friends when my mans go away. Let's stand in the land where the fam won't stay. Grind all day till the fam okay. But still want my heart to hear my grandma play. For the fam and my friends when my mans go away.
Grandma's Prayers. One of the good things about family, as noted there in the 2012 chant song called Family. Now, the experts on the notion of family are our colleagues over at Family Fire. That's a partner ministry of TC. They have a website and a really active Facebook community that encourages families in their faith. You can check it out at familyfire.com. I was talking to Family Fire producer Deb Coster about this episode of the podcast, just getting her basic take on the topic. And she shared this. Our families are the place where our faith develops as we are challenged and encouraged to live into our identity as image bearers of God. God himself exists in loving community, and we as image bearers thrive in that same context. Good stuff there from Deb. There are all sorts of family resources over at familyfire.com. So this is the place where we usually ask for your reviews on Apple Podcasts. Well, this time, I want to thank you for those reviews. Thanks to our VelociPastor Challenge, we recently passed our goal of 70 reviews, so I appreciate that. Now, what is the VelociPastor, you might ask? Well, the favorite film, I believe, of J.R. Forasteros, a member of the podcast team. It's about a priest who attains the power to become a dinosaur. Really, I think that's what it's about. J.R.'s been trying to get me to watch this thing for a while now, so I promised we would do it after 70 reviews. Here we are. So we're going to devote our next show to pop culture pastors. That means we need something else to pair with the VelociPastor. So another movie, maybe a TV series, I don't know, maybe even a song that features an ordained man or woman or dinosaur of God. If you have a suggestion, go ahead and send it our way. Email us, tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net. We'd also love to have you visit the TC website, thinkchristian.net. If you want to make sure you don't miss out on any of our posts, you can subscribe to receive our emails at thinkchristian.net/subscribe. And of course, you can always follow us on Facebook and Twitter at thinkchristian. Don't forget about our Spotify playlists compiled by John J. Thompson. On the latest collection, you can hear Chance the Rapper's Family, the Cranberries' Ode to My Family, and a couple dozen other songs on that theme. Just search for the Think Christian playlist on Spotify. The Think Christian podcast is a production of Reframe Ministries, a family of programs designed to help you see your whole life reframed by God's gospel story. Visit reframeministries.org for more info. Our audio engineer and post-production supervisor is John Reeder, and Reframe's co-director overseeing content strategy is Robin Bassett. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks to consider how another aspect of our pop culture fandom, specifically the VelociPastor, connects with our faith.